Council meeting. I will invite John to take the roll call and also the summons of the meeting.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, members. To all members of Derry City and Strabane District Council, you're hereby summoned to attend this special meeting of the Council, which will be a hybrid meeting conducted remotely via WebEx and physically here in the Council Chamber, Wednesday, the 19th of February at 2 o'clock. Starting, as the Mayor has said, with the roll call, Alderman Cook, Alderman Guy, Alderman Hussey.
Online, John.
Alderman Carrigan.
Online, John.
Alderman McMorris.
Online, John. Can I put an
Alderman
apology
Middleton.
in?
Alderman Montgomery.
Here.
Alderman Wilkinson.
John, it's Alderman Middleton. I'm here as well. Sorry.
Is here. Yeah. Councillor Jason Barr.
Here, John.
Councillor Lillian Barr.
Here.
Councillor Raymond Barr.
Here, John.
Apologies received from Councillor Boggs. Councillor Boyle. Councillor Clark.
Shaw.
Councillor Cusick.
Online, John.
Councillor Deeney.
And Shaw.
Councillor Devine. Councillor Donnelly. Councillor Alex Duffy. Councillor Sandra Duffy.
Shaw.
Councillor Farrell. Councillor Fleming.
Shaw.
Councillor Gallagher.
And Shaw.
Councillor Harkin.
Here.
Councillor Hart.
Shaw.
Councillor Heaney. Councillor Hutton. Councillor Jackson.
Shaw.
Councillor Leonard.
And Shaw.
Councillor Logue.
And Shaw.
Councillor McDade. Sorry. Apologies. Thank you. Councillor McGinley. Councillor McHugh. Councillor Mooney. Councillor Murphy. Councillor apologies from Councillor Norris. Councillor O'Farrell.
Shaw, John.
Councillor Riley.
Online, John.
Councillor Tierney. Councillor Neelis.
Carolina.
Thank you very much, members.
Okay, members, the next agenda item is broadcasting statement, and I would like to remind everyone physically present at this meeting or in attendance remotely that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeating viewing. This broadcast may be terminated or suspended in accordance with our protocol. Due to your attendance at this meeting, you are consenting to being filmed and to the use and storage of those images for broadcasting or training purposes and for the purposes of keeping historical records and making those records available to the public. Members and approved speakers are reminded to only have their mics and cameras on while speaking at the meeting and to use the chat facility to highlight a request to speak. A copy of the Council privacy notice may be found on the Council's website. Okay, members, I do not have any chairperson's business, but we have a very important discussion ahead. And I know that we all appreciate the opportunity to hear directly from those working on the ground to support individuals transitioning through the justice system into appropriate housing. We are very privileged today to have with us key representatives from the Probation Board for Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, two organizations playing a critical role in ensuring that those coming through the justice system are housed safely and appropriately within our communities. But this meeting today is for us to hear from them, to understand the procedures, the challenges and opportunities within this area. So I would first like to welcome Mrs. Liz Arthur, Assistant Director, and Mrs. Anne Ware, Area Manager from the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. Their work is central to this work, and we're really delighted that you're here to speak to us. May I also acknowledge members of the public who are at the public gallery, and we look forward to hear from you.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon and to address you all on the role of approved premises. When I left Belfast this morning, it was dull and overcast, so it was great to arrive at Ebrington and walk across the Peace Bridge when the sun was shining and it was nice and dry. And it's lovely to be in this building. The last time I was here, it was at the Jazz Festival in the summer, so happy memories. My name's Liz Arthur. I'm an Assistant Director with the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. I'm Assistant Director for Public Protection, which means I have senior management responsibility for individuals who've committed sexual offences and perpetrators of domestic violence who are subject to statutory supervision in the community. I also have the lead role with between the work of PBNI and the public protection arrangements for Northern Ireland, and also with our approved premises. And with me this afternoon, I have my colleague, Anne Weir. Anne is an area manager based here in Derry in our Shipquay Street office and has responsibility for the Promoting Positive Relationships programme, PPRP. We love our acronyms in probation. So that programme is an intervention that addresses both the attitudes and behaviour of individuals who perpetrate intimate partner violence, and it's delivered to both adjudicated and unadjudicated offenders. Apologies, I have notes. I'm of that age. If I haven't written it down, I forget to do it, or in this case, I forget to read it. So apologies for that. I think it's important at the very start to say that the vast majority of probation, the Probation Board service users are accommodated in their own homes with their own families. And it's unusual for individuals not to be able to return to live with their families in their own communities. But for some service users, that's just not possible. And they need to be in what we call approved premises to manage their risk. It's important also to say at the outset that the Probation Board for Northern Ireland doesn't actually own or indeed manage any of the approved premises. The Probation Board, Northern Ireland Order 1982, sets out the function of the Probation Board in relation to the provision of accommodation. And Article 4.2 gives provision to PBNI with the authority of the Department of Justice to enter into arrangements with community and voluntary organisations for the provision of hostels. The approved premises are funded by Supporting People, and they are required to adhere to Supporting People regulations, and they are subject to accreditation by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. But that's very much in respect of the premises and the buildings and the fixtures and fittings. The actual service that the approved premises provide is reviewed or inspected by the Criminal Justice Inspectorate for Northern Ireland. So there are a total of 7 approved premises across Northern Ireland, which provide 91 beds. 4 of the approved premises are in Belfast. So Thompson House, which is run by the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, is in North Belfast, and it provides 19 beds or 19 places. Dismas House and Innes and Must are all run by Extern. Dismas is in South Belfast and provides 14 places. Innes is in the centre of Belfast and provides 20 places. And Must, which stands for Mid-Ulster and South Tyrone, is in Cookstown and it provides 6 beds. Centenary House is run by the Salvation Army. It's also in the centre of Belfast and we have 19 places there. And then the Simon community runs 2 hostels, Edward Street, which is in Portadown and provides 15 beds, and then here in Derry, Bonds Hill, where we have 4 beds. There are a number of idiosyncrasies between the hostels. Some of them also accept direct access referrals. So Must, Centenary House and Bonds Hill also have direct access beds. Centenary House doesn't accept any individual who's committed offences against adult females, and actually Must and Bonds Hill are the only 2 of the approved premises that will accept female service users.
Excellent.
So approved premises, they provide an enhanced level of public protection to assist the Probation Board in managing offenders in the community. They have 2 main roles. Firstly, to protect the public. And it's very important to say that service users should only be referred to approved premises if the additional external controls that are provided by these approved premises are required to manage their risk in the community. Service users should not be referred to approved premises solely to address homelessness. I suppose if I can just touch on some of the external controls that the approved premises provide. As I've noted there, they are all staffed 24 hours a day. They also have curfews in place. There's nighttime curfews. Individuals are expected to be in the hostels at 10 o'clock at night and not to leave the hostel until 8 o'clock the next morning. Additional curfews can be put in place if that's required. They also have CCTV, and they also have trained staff there who obviously can see how individuals are presenting, and if there's concerns, if they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, etc., then that can be passed on to their supervising probation officer. The second role of the approved premises is to rehabilitate and resettle high-risk offenders. And the service users in each of the premises are supported by hostel staff to address any factors that are linked to their offending behaviour and also to prepare them to live independently in the future. All residents in the approved premises are supervised by PBNI and are managed in accordance with our practice standards. If somebody is not subject to statutory supervision, they will be opened up as an inescapable voluntary client and will be managed, as I say, in line with our practice standards. So, for example, the level of contact that a probation officer would have with an individual is determined by the level of risk that they present. The higher risk the individual is, the more frequently they will be seen. I want to emphasise today just the importance of stable accommodation in the lives of offenders. We know that there is a direct link between homelessness and offending behaviour, and we know that family and social supports coupled with stable accommodation can directly address the factors associated with offending behaviour. It enables service users to benefit from probation supervision and also improves their engagement in programmes of intervention and services that are provided by other organisations, such as the trusts and various community and voluntary organisations. The facts on that slide say it all. So housing has been identified as one of the key factors that can reduce reoffending by as much as 20%. And research also shows us that if somebody's in an approved premises, the likelihood of being reconvicted is 3.1% compared to somebody who's in mainstream accommodation, where it is 36.6%. PBNI service users are often seen as the undeserving homeless, that they've brought it upon themselves through their offending behaviour. And clearly there is some truth in that, but that perception ignores the reasons why somebody does become involved or can become involved in offending behaviour. And often that is through no fault of their own, but because they have experienced some form of trauma in their lives. The individuals that PBNI work with often have significant vulnerabilities which need to be addressed if we're going to prevent them from being involved in further offending behaviour. 40% of the people we work with have mental health problems and 76% have problems with addictions. Many have experienced adverse childhood experiences, for example, the incarceration of a parent or being sexually abused as a child. And we know that research tells us that individuals who have 4+ adverse childhood experiences are 20 times more likely to end up going to prison in later life. If I can just say a wee bit about the processes and procedures that are in place. As I said right at the outset, to be referred to an approved premises, an individual needs to be there to manage the risk that they present. And our referral criteria would say that they need to have been assessed by PBNI as presenting a high likelihood of reoffending. They need to be assessed, or they need to have been assessed by the Public Protection Arrangements for Northern Ireland, PANI, as either a Category 2 or a Category 3 offender. We have a referral process. There's a standard application form that needs to be completed with as much information available, and that's sent to a centralised hostel mailbox, preferably well in advance of the individual being released from prison so that all the necessary checks and balances can be carried out. We need to attach all relevant information to that referral form so that hostel staff are aware of the licence conditions that somebody is subject to, or if they are subject to a sexual offences prevention order or a violent offences prevention order, that needs to be attached as well. So the hostel staff are aware what that individual is allowed to do and isn't allowed to do. The hostel panel meets on a weekly basis. It's chaired by a probation area manager, and at that panel, all the referrals received are discussed and the cases are prioritised. We try wherever possible to take other factors into consideration. So we try to place people as near to their home where they will have the support of their family and other support networks. We also take into consideration, for example, where a victim resides. So we're not going to place somebody in an approved premises if that's in close proximity to where their victim lives. I've already said that we manage the individuals in approved premises according to our practice standards, and that ensures continuity no matter who's been supervised, where and by whom. It's very important to have, for PBNI to engage with local communities, and hence why I welcome this opportunity today as well. It's important that we try to help local communities understand what supervision entails and help them to know that what arrangements are in place to protect the public, and that we will take enforcement action if somebody does not adhere to their licence conditions or their civil orders. We have a number of challenges. One of the main challenges that we face is decisions not being able to be taken about where somebody is to be placed until very soon before they are released. And that means we can't set up things like doctor's appointments and addiction appointments if we don't know where they're going to be. But unfortunately, just the pressure on beds means that often we don't know that where they're actually going to be placed until the very last minute. You'll appreciate it's not possible to hold a bed for any length of time. So if we're waiting, for example, for a parole commissioner to make a decision as to whether or not to re-release somebody back into the community, that can take a number of weeks, if not a number of months. And it would be, I think, morally wrong to hold a bed for that individual if there's somebody else that needs that bed. So often decisions are being taken very close to the date that somebody's actually been released from prison. Another challenge is just the service users that we're working with at the moment are presenting with very complex needs. The prison population is an ageing population. There's a lot of elderly people within our prisons, and prisoners often are presenting with complex needs in respect of mental health and drug addiction. A huge challenge for us is moving individuals on from approved premises. I often refer to it as bed blocking, similar to patients in hospitals not being able to be discharged from hospital until they have a care package in place. Sometimes we find it difficult to move people on from approved premises, and that's for a number of reasons, primarily just because of the challenges that are in the wider housing sector at the moment, and I know my colleagues will be touching on that later. But you just have to listen to the news to know that there's an increased number of people on the waiting lists for statutory housing, and there is an increase in the demand for temporary accommodation, and that clearly impacts on our service users as well. There's also community concerns, not in my backyard. Individuals can Google somebody and find out why they've been in prison, and then they're concerned about the individual being in that particular area. So there's lots of, as I say, challenges on moving people on. And sometimes we do get to the stage where we have to issue what I refer to as notice to quit letters. And that is telling the person that they've got 4 weeks, they need to move on from the approved premises. And that's where we work closely with our colleagues in the Housing Executive to find alternative accommodation. Another challenge, and thankfully this happens very rarely, is where none of the approved premises will accept somebody because they deem them to be too high risk to be managed by themselves. And as I say, that happens very, very rarely. But it obviously places more pressure on the probation board to manage that individual when we're not sure where they're going to reside. The approved premises do have difficulty in recruiting and retaining staff. It's often referred to as the Tesco effect. Why would somebody work in that very challenging environment when they can earn probably just as much working in Tesco's or any other? There are other supermarkets available, but you know the point that I'm making. Just want to touch on, and I said it earlier, the approved premises are subject to be reviewed by the Criminal Justice Inspectorate for Northern Ireland, and that should give reassurance to communities and to elected representatives that they are professionally run establishments. So the Sigini Criminal Justice Inspectorate review of approved premises was completed in 2022, with the report being published in March 2023. And the review assessed the contribution that approved premises make to resettlement, rehabilitation and public protection outcomes within Northern Ireland. It also assessed the role of criminal justice organisations such as the Probation Board for Northern Ireland in supporting the work of the approved premises. And the review concluded that the approved premises provide an essential service to the criminal justice system, and that day-to-day operational practice is good, and the working relationships between the approved premises and the criminal justice agencies is also good. The review concluded that approved premises staff are inspiring, caring people who are highly committed to their work. The review did make 1 strategic recommendation and 4 operational recommendations. The strategic recommendation, as is noticed there, is to develop a strategic framework which clarifies the vision, strategy, oversight arrangements of the approved premises and the respective organisations' roles and expectations for approved premises. The review did find that there was a lack of clarity about the ownership of the vision and the strategy and the lines of accountability. The approved premises are referred to as PB&I approved premises, but we actually have no lines of accountability over them. And it's not clear what the lines of accountability are. So the strategic recommendation is trying to pull that one together. And then there were 3 very practical operational recommendations. The review said that we needed to do more to remove barriers to resettlement, such as ensuring that prisoners, when they're coming out of prisons, have photographic ID, they've had email accounts created, they've had bank accounts created. They also said there needed to be clarification about moving on, and we have focused on that, and we have established timescales when individuals should be moving on from approved premises. It should be unusual for somebody to be in an approved premises for longer than 12 months, but that, as I said, is all determined by whether they need to be there to manage their risk, and occasionally we do have people there for much longer than that. And the final operational recommendation was just acknowledging the role that the hostel key workers have. They know these individuals better than many other professionals do, so they should be involved in the risk management of the individuals. They should be invited to PB&I risk management meetings. They should be invited to the PANI public protection arrangements, LAPS, local area public protection panels. And finally, I just want to say it's important to, and that's why I welcome being here today, it's important that we do engage with communities, that we do meet with elected representatives, and that we do take on board the concerns of victims. You would expect me as a representative of PB&I to be extremely positive about the role of approved premises in helping us do our job, that is manage offenders in the community. But it has also been, their role that they play has also been acknowledged by various victim organisations, not least Nexus and NSPCC. And I've just included a quote there from Colin Reid. He's actually moved on from the NSPCC now, but he did say about hostel accommodation playing a fundamental part in public protection and child protection. And at times it's important that those who have offended can access structured accommodation. This may be about providing a period of assessment before returning to the community, or as a structured plan to manage risk and include attendance at treatment programmes. And I think that is me, and I'm not sure whether you want to take questions now or whether you want to hear from my colleagues in the Housing Executive and then have questions all at the end.
Thank you, Liz. I think we will ask questions and then we'll bring. Thank you, Councillor Sandra.
Mayor, I am not looking to ask a question. I just want to make a declaration of interest. I think I missed it at the start. I work for an organisation that is funded through the Housing Executive, and I also spent a period of time working in Bonsall. So just need to make that declaration.
Thank you, Councillor Duffy. Okay, members, I will open for discussion or questions or comments. Councillor Jackson.
Mayor, and thanks, Liz. On behalf of Sinn Féin, we welcome you to the chamber today. And it was a very informative presentation, and there's been on a very sensitive issue, and it's hard to argue with anything that you've presented today. Stable accommodation is something that we want to see right across the board, and we recognise the link between people that are able to achieve stable accommodation and those people that reoffend. And the adverse childhood experiences is something that we've heard quite a lot about, but we're hearing, and it's widely recognised that that adverse childhood experiences can have a negative impact on people's lives. We're hearing that from people within our community as well, and that is a cause of concern when people are recognising the effects of adverse childhood experiences, and they want to protect their children from those experiences. So that is something that people are becoming more and more conscious of, and trying to protect children from those experiences. So it all does tie in, and we all want to protect children from experiencing adverse childhood experiences, and we want to protect children from witnessing things that children shouldn't witness. So it's good that we're all on the one page in that regard. And I, as somebody who represents the Waterside DEA, I do recognise the fantastic work that does happen within Bonsall, and the fact that there isn't a lot of regular concern from neighbouring properties. That demonstrates the work that goes on and the effectiveness and the professionalism of those that are working within the Simon community. And I suppose just given that model works, there's and we know that the unapproved premises, if they can cause concerns or uncertainty, is there any potential prospect of expanding the approved premises in the city? Because I know as you alluded to in your presentation around the bed pressures and shortages and issues that are arising from that. But just on the final point in relation to the representative from NSPCC and his quote, it is essential that we engage with victims groups and engage with communities. How just for examples of how the probation board engage with communities and how you engage with victims groups. So just would like to hear a wee bit more about that. I couldn't agree more that it is an essential piece of work, but I just would like to understand more how that works carried out. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. I'll address your first question first, which I think was about is there any potential to increase the number of beds? So there's 4 approved beds within Derry. The Northern Ireland Prison Service is actually completing a piece of work to almost predict, if that's the right word, the number of people who they expect to be coming out of prison over the next number of years who will meet the criteria for improved premises to determine whether we need to increase the number of beds. I suspect, given what I've said about the importance of people being located in their own communities and having the support of family and other support networks, it is important that people from Derry can return to Derry and aren't being housed in an improved premises in Belfast. And we're keen to do that as much as possible. So there is a piece of work ongoing that hopefully will clarify that more. In respect of our engagement with victims, we do that in a number of ways. We have a victim information scheme where victims can register, and we will keep them up to date, apprised of how somebody is doing when they're subject to supervision. We'll then take on board some of the concerns that they may have. So, for example, we can impose or ask that the licensing unit impose a restriction on their licence so they can't go into a particular area if that's where the victims' children go to school, for example. So we can take on board what victims are telling us in that respect, and it can be very practical on somebody's licence. And we also, as part of the public protection arrangements for Northern Ireland, there are a number of subgroups, and there's a victims subgroup, and that is chaired by the NSPCC and its representatives from victims group, and they have a big impact on the work of the public protection arrangements. All of us are involved in this work to protect victims and to ensure that there are no more victims as far as we possibly can, and that's the motivation to do the work. So we always have the victim in the room with us when we're determining how to manage somebody. Engagement with communities, that's something I know we could do better and we should do better, because local communities may have concerns about particular approved premises. We do it on a kind of ad hoc basis. It tends to be, if something happens in an area, but it's probably something we could do on a more organised basis.
Okay. Councillor Barr online.
Thank you, Mayor.
Raymond Barr.
Thank you, Mayor. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Liz and Anne, for attending this meeting today. Liz, well, initially this motion was brought to council in the aftermath of a serious incident in Ballymagorry and the resulting charge of a young man who was staying at a nearby premises, which was being used to house those in bail, the Coach Inn and Clogcar.
Councillor Barr,
anger.
do you want to go closer to your mic? I think there are people who are struggling.
Okay. I might look into that at the moment, Mayor. After that incident in Ballymagorry, there was widespread anger in the area at the time, and a public meeting was called by residents. However, despite being invited, none of the statutory agencies attended the meeting to answer questions from the public, hence the motion to council. As you've covered a lot of what I was going to ask around procedures and processes in your presentation, so it just leaves questions around whether or not the procedures are being implemented. I'm going to refer to the curfew. Now, 2 consecutive weeks before the incident in Ballymagorry, I run a licensed premises in Strabane. I had reason to remove 4 young men from the premises for intimidatory behaviour. Now, that was well after the curfew time, and these 4 young men had turned out that they were staying in the Coach Inn and Clogcar. They told me that they were out in bail. Another major concern centres on the number of premises which are being used in the council district. I've read recently 41% of the budget allocated for temporary accommodation is being spent in our council area. And if that figure is accurate, it would indicate our district is being used as an open ground and there's not a fair spread of this type of accommodation. I also want to make it clear that I have no problem with the concept of the use of approved accommodation, but I do believe as the public we represent too that there are questions to be asked around the processes and procedures and whether or not they're being implemented properly. I have a couple of more questions, but they're probably better directed at the Housing Executive. But thank you once again, Liz and Anne, for attending here today.
Thank you, Councillor Barr. I'll just check if did you get the questions?
I'm not sure I did, but I probably have picked up enough. I hope you appreciate I can't talk about any specific case. You did, Councillor, reference bail conditions. When I was talking about curfews, I was talking about curfews in the approved premises, so that would be Bonds Hill within Derry. Obviously, bail conditions vary from individual to individual, and that's a matter for the PSNI. So if somebody is in breach of their bail conditions, that needs to be reported to the police, and then they can take appropriate action. I'm not sure if there was another question there. Sorry.
Councillor Barr, are you happy with that response?
Yes, that's fine, Mayor. As I say, I've
Thank
a
you,
couple more
Councillor Barr.
questions, but for the Housing Executive.
Okay, moving on to Councillor Mooney.
Mayor, if I could maybe just add to the question. I'm sorry, I know the hearing. I know we maybe struggle just to hear, but certainly I heard Councillor Barr referencing an uneven spread of temporary accommodation focused on Derry, on the city. And I just wanted to let you know that the Housing Executive has almost in and around 6,000 temporary accommodation places across all of Northern Ireland, and of those 970 are in Derry. So actually the majority of temporary accommodation places are by far the largest number of temporary accommodation provision is in Belfast, because that is where the majority demand is from. But I just wanted to reassure Council that the spread of temporary accommodation reflects where the demand areas are, and that is Belfast first, followed by Derry, followed by other council areas. So there are 6,000 places, of which 900, just over 900 are in Derry. So just to give that context, if I could.
Thank you, Jennifer, and we will hear more from you shortly. Councillor Mooney.
Thank you, Chair. And can I say thank you to Liz and Anne for coming down for the presentation. Obviously, it was as Councillor Barr did outline, it was on the back of a terrible incident there not so long ago, and just up the road outside Strabane there. But it's really my question is a follow-on question from what Councillor Jackson asked, was about if there's any possible expansion in the 4 licensed premises. Obviously, you know, the licensed premises, they're maintained and controlled by probation, would be a lot better capacity than then say unapproved or unlicensed premises. But I'm glad that you did refer to the legislation surrounding the creation and of the probation board, but it's Article 4.2, and looking at it when I was looking at it last night, it said the board may, with the approval of Department of Justice. So obviously that's not even a mandatory, it's a sort of discretionary piece of legislation that can allow you to expand or even to contract the size of approved spaces, and that's subject to the DOJ, probably funding wise. That leads me to my question. If you wanted to expand the size of, let's say, licensed beds or, accommodation, let's say in Derry here, would you have the budgetary capacity at the moment to do that, even if you wanted to do that? Because obviously, in the light of the totality of the situation, like let's say the size of the prison population in this jurisdiction, you have McGabry, you have McGilligan, the YOC, and you've got the Juvenile Justice Centre. And I suppose my previous occupation was I was a solicitor in the town, so I would have plenty of, I would have been ringing the most hostels and Bonds Hill, when we had clients looking for, let's say, bail hostels and things like that there. So I would have knowledge of licence conditions and things like that there. But it really does give that sort of it really would give or convey that sense of reassurance for the general public that if the prisoners, or let's say who were actually, coming out of, prisons and on licensed conditions were going to approved accommodation, it would generally create a much better sense of reassurance for local communities, because they would know that probation is there. They would have support workers who know what those people who are coming under these accommodations need and their requirements. So, but generally, you can't do anything if you don't have the budget. But maybe my question is, would you have, would it be budgetary constraints that would restrain you from moving on? Thank you, Chair.
I don't want to appear to be avoiding the question, but supporting people probably are better placed. I mean, we passed our budget in respect of approved premises over to supporting people, I think back in 2003 or 2004. So it doesn't actually come out of PB&I's budget in respect. But similar to what Jennifer was saying about the number of approved premises places is based on where the people are as well. So 4 seemed an appropriate number for Derry. But if that changes, then and as I said, there is a piece of work that the Northern Ireland Prison Services are undertaking to try and determine if there needs to be more.
Thank you. Councillor Mooney?
Just a follow up there, Chair. I mean, just on the basis where you say if you have 4 here in Derry, I don't have the formula as to how that obviously is accrued or how it's come by, but it would seem to me that 4 would be slightly below maybe the level of what maybe the local community would deem as reassurance. But obviously, my point was that the board, being actually the probation board, they do have the duty under the legislation under 4.2, and I'm not saying that I should say that you preface your remarks by saying that somebody else has that rule, and I accept that. But it would seem light at 4 beds in the size of the city, and given our prison population, maybe would look at maybe work would be required into that sort of. But again, I don't have the formulas, therefore I can't really definitively comment on that. But thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Mooney. Okay, moving on to Councillor Harkin.
Thank you, Mayor, for letting me in, and thank you, Liz and Anne, for coming today to the council. It's very useful to be able to have these discussions, and I agree with all our colleagues here. This is a very complex and sensitive issue that we need to be careful in terms of how we discuss it and the language that we use. And I do agree that organisations like the Simon Community and Extern do fantastic work. I don't think that they're funded well enough, and that is part of the thing that I want to kind of address. So look, I think that we have to, there's a lot of people in our prisons. Some people have done terrible things. But there also has to be a pathway out of prison for as many people as possible who are offenders. And I think that we have to invest in that. I think that the level of reoffending is far too high right now in our society. And I think that that comes down to, in my opinion, not enough investment into pathways out of offending. And obviously, investing in stopping reoffending is about keeping the community safe. And I think, as you said, we have to be thinking constantly about the victims, and we have to be thinking constantly about our communities. And look, I also think that the vast majority of people in prison tend to be working class, tend to be poor, tend to, as other people have said, have had very complex lives with all sorts of different traumas and challenges that they're facing now that makes it more and more difficult for them to kind of sometimes escape a pattern of reoffending. And so, look, it's easy sometimes to just say, we'll throw away the key and we'll forget about them once they're put in prison. But that doesn't actually solve the structural problems that lead to imprisonment for a lot of people, and also that leads to reoffending. So I think that this is, for me, I suppose, again, this comes back to resources, and are we properly investing in it? Are we supporting the workers who are working with people in terms of rehabilitation? Are we making sure that they are that there's the type of wraparound services that people need when they're dealing with complex issues in order to avoid reoffending and also to give communities confidence that there's actually a plan. And I suppose as well, you know, that is, because we'll talk about it a bit more in terms of the non-standard accommodation that the housing executive has been forced to use. It does seem to me that, you know, there's a question there about could we have more approved premises, because it's about dedicating the type of resources that we need in order to address the different aspects of this question, both for assisting people to you know, avoid reoffending, and also to give communities a sense of that they're protected and that the state, the authorities actually have a handle on what's going on. So I know that comes down to budgets, but sometimes I think that there's in terms of the mechanisms that are in place, in paper they can look good, but then is there gaps because the funding that is needed to actually follow through on that isn't there. Thank you.
I entirely agree with everything that you've said. I mean, the budgetary constraints have been challenging. It's had an impact not just on accommodation, but other areas, other support services that are available. I mean, it's so much more difficult to get a service in respect of addictions now, because services have been reduced, and it probably is short-sighted. I mean, if you look at how much it costs to keep somebody in prison for a year compared to in the community, if there was the proper resources and services available to help manage that person. So yeah, I do agree.
Thank you. Councillor Logue.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you both to Liz and for the presentation. Certainly found it very informative to myself. I've just got two questions, and one sort of is drawing a number of questions that have been answered. But just for a wee bit more clarity, I suppose, for myself, given that there's only 91 approved probation addresses available in the whole of the North, I'm sure there's more people, and sorry, just before I say that, some of the people that are placed in these probation addresses could be there for a year, maybe longer, just depending on their circumstances. So the turnover would be, I suppose, slow. But I'm sure there's more people who come up for probation more regularly than this. So what happens in those occasions? Does it depend on an approved probation address, or have the probation service ever used unregistered probation addresses, if you know what I'm saying? I hope that makes sense. And the second question is, you touched on it yourself, Liz, that you felt that the key workers, who are the people who work with the clients 24/7, 7 days a week, and they do know the people best compared to, I suppose, and I don't mean this in a bad way, people like yourself who might only come across them once a month or once every 3 months or whatever, those making the decisions on probation are the key. You said the key workers should be part of the risk assessment and be present. Are they not? You know, when the person needs to, when you're deciding should this person move forward. Thank you.
I'll maybe answer your second question first while it's fresh in my head. They definitely are involved. They would be very much part of that. We have a minimum of bi-monthly tripartites, which would be the supervising probation officer, the key worker in the hostel, and the individual themselves. I suppose where that operational recommendation came from, it was more for inviting them to the formal risk management meetings under the public protection arrangements. I used to chair those laps back in the day, and the key workers from the hostel were always there. And then that seemed to, I don't know for why, that seemed to just stop. But so it was just reinstating that again and ensuring, as you rightly say, the people who know the residents the best were actually there. So that is happening. But there's always been that really good communication between the hostel worker and the probation officer. And I mean, they would be on the phone if there's concerns daily. They pass the information on to the probation officer, and then the probation officer makes a decision. Does that warrant us taking enforcement action, or do we need to refer them to another service, et cetera, et cetera? The first point was around just the number of beds and the turnover. Yeah.
Just, just to reiterate, I am sure, but maybe you can confirm or not confirm, that there's more than 91 people coming out from or applying for or being granted probation. Do all of those or not need to go to a registered address? I understand that they might be able to return to their own home, or I totally understand that. But all the people deemed to need that support moving forward, or who can't return to their own address, or who haven't got an address, what happens to those people if there's no approved spaces available? That's the question.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the people in our approved premises are the critical few, the critical 91. They're the highest risk, but there are times when we can't put somebody in a bed because there isn't one available. And sometimes that is what I refer to the bed blocking, but we're getting better at that. It used to be somebody wouldn't move from an approved premises into another temporary accommodation. It just didn't seem right, but now, unfortunately, that's the reality. So they may not need to be in an approved premises to manage their risk. They may not need all those external controls in place, but they may then move to a direct access hostel. So it's still temporary accommodation. If we can't get somebody into an approved premises and we're concerned about the risk, there are other things like electronic monitoring. So we can get somebody tagged to an address so that they can, they can't leave that address between whatever hours we deem are appropriate. So there are other measures that we can put in place, but we need to get better at moving people on from the approved premises. And it's it's difficult to send somebody a letter saying you have to leave this address. But I can't stand over. That's not defensible. If they don't need to be there to manage the risk, and we've got a high risk individual coming out of custody who does need to be there, I mean, it's a no-brainer. That person needs to move on. And we need to put the high risk person into the approved premises. If we could get better at the moving people on, I think it would go a long way to resolving the issue that we have, and we are getting better at that. But it's making those hard decisions, and somebody shouldn't be in an approved premises for longer than 12 months. That should be an extremely rare occasion, and only if they need to be there to manage their risk.
Thank you both. I have Councillor Raymond Barr online. Are you looking to come back in?
Yes, Mayor, very, very quickly. Just the claim that 41% of the entire budget allocated to temporary accommodation is being spent on Derry City and Strabane District Council area. Could Liz or Anne comment on the accuracy of that claim?
I think, Councillor, that will be a question that the Housing Executive will be better pleased to answer.
Councillor Barr, we will come to you when we get the presentation from the Housing Executive. Is that okay?
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Moving on to Councillor Boyle.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to Liz and Anne as well for coming in. I certainly do appreciate your coming in and explaining the work that you do and the challenges that you face, and very clearly you're working in a very complicated field of endeavour, which is, as others have already said, very sensitive in many regards. And I think I agree with Councillor Harkin, language around how we deal with particular challenges that people face, whether they be members of the public or whether they be the clients that you're working with. That's an important understanding, and I think it's important that we continue these types of dialogue so that the public can actually better understand the work that you do and the assurances that you can give them as well. And I think that has all been referenced by others here as well, you know. I do have a couple of questions, but actually my question is, this question is probably related to what Councillor Logue was asking you as well, which was a similar type question. And I'm sitting here, and I know that possibly the answer lies over here with your housing executive colleagues, and I will acknowledge that that possibly is the case, and I'm sure they'll take a note of it and answer it if it does. But I'm kind of wondering what the interface looks like between PBNI and the housing executive in relation to, as Councillor Logue says, you know, other people who can't be accommodated in approved accommodation. I understand what she means. You know, there's, from my sense, I'm sure there are many, many more people that you deal with than you can put on approved accommodation. So I'm kind of thinking about what does that interface look like? How do you work together to have your clients placed wherever it may well be that they are? I'm sure we'll probably find out again from housing executive colleagues. That's one question. And another question, and it's probably just down to my own ignorance in relation to this, Liz, truthfully. So for example, you know, you've got 4 bed spaces here in Derry and Bonds Hill. Are your clients sharing properties with other people who are not your clients, if you understand what I mean? In other words, you've got 4 beds, are there another 8 or 10 people in that same premises? So, it's just a question for my own benefit, and I'm sure it would be a useful answer to those that might not know the answer either, you know, Liz. So that's really where I'm coming at this from. And as I said, it'll relate to Jennifer and Brian and Eddie as well, I would imagine. So if you've got a comment to make around that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah, we work very closely with our colleagues in the housing executive. We work closely with the housing advice officers. Each approved premises would have housing advice officers nominated for that. So the supervising probation officers would work closely with them. It really should be when somebody moves into an approved premises that right from the start, you're planning for their move on. So that's why we need to keep those lines of communication between ourselves and the housing executive open. We work very closely with them out of hours as well. Sometimes individuals who haven't got accommodation, and we're linking in with the out of hours provision that the housing executive provide as well. And just to say as well, under the public protection arrangements, under PANI, there's an accommodation subgroup, and that is chaired by a senior representative from the housing executive. So they're bringing their expertise to the arrangements as well. And in respect of the accommodation, yes, some of the approved premises are mixed, if I can use that word. So there'd be approved beds, and then there'd be direct access referrals as well. And Bonds Hill is one of those. So I'm not actually sure how many beds there are in Bonds Hill, a lot, but only 4 of them are approved premises. Yeah.
Thank you both. Okay, members, I will move on to the housing executive. We are joined by Jennifer, Brian, and Eddie. So over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, as always, to be in Derry, and I know you all know Eddie very well. Brian, my colleague, heads up the homelessness policy, strategic policy unit, and I look after homelessness and the 83,000 housing executive properties that we own and manage. So obviously today, I know that the specific motion was looking at the term bail hostels. There's no such thing as a bail hostel. The housing executive does not operate bail hostels, so I just need to be very clear about that. But I thought it was important because I know how much of councillors' time is spent on housing issues. It is one of the key issues that is addressing Northern Ireland, and that's why we're seeing a lot of debate in public about the significant shortages of housing, and there is no doubt that this city is absolutely experiencing that very acutely. So I thought it was important for us to share with you what our role is in people leaving prison, but also the broader temporary accommodation provision, because I wanted to be clear that our temporary accommodation provision is for everyone. It is not bail hostels, and the housing executive doesn't operate bail hostels. Okay, so we talked about our statutory responsibilities earlier in terms of probation board. Just to set the context on the, forgive me, this screen doesn't work, so I'm going to keep looking over my shoulder. Okay, looking at the gloriousness of Eddie is, of course, what I'm looking at. We have a statutory duty. So in other words, you have a legal right through the housing executive to provide temporary accommodation and permanent housing when we work through that. So when someone presents to the housing executive, they do so when they meet the 4 tests. And you know the tests, I don't need, you will all know housing, you will all know homelessness, but it's eligibility. So are you entitled? Are you eligible to apply? And that can often be for those that have no recourse to public funds. So there's an eligibility criteria. I'm not getting into that. Are you homeless, which is the other one of the 4 criteria. Are you in priority need? That would be priority need. We all know that would be people who are vulnerable, who have mental health issues, physical disabilities, families, etc. So that priority need has to be established. Once you meet those 3 tests of the 4, we have a statutory duty to provide you with temporary accommodation if you require it, okay? We cannot absolve ourselves of that statutory duty, and we must provide accommodation. You can imagine, and we're going to go into some absolutely shocking statistics in terms of the scale. When you get that person presenting, and we provide a 24-hour, not only a daytime, but an out-of-hour homeless response service, if you meet those 3 tests, we must provide you with temporary accommodation. Otherwise, we are failing in our statutory duty. So that's the test, okay? And that's where we have to do everything we can and find accommodation, okay, where we can for those households. Next slide, please. Just this table, I know it's probably hard to read there, but look, the reason I wanted to show you this is that the numbers of presenters are not increasing. They're staying steady every year. We're sitting at around 16, nearly 17,000 new presenters every year. But if you look back in 2019-20, it was 16,800. So it's a steady year-on-year number who present to us as homeless. The issue is that those people are not being moved on. So we're sitting with 55,000 people in total in our waiting list because unfortunately the availability of permanent rehousing options has reduced so significantly. That is dependent on 2 factors. The first one being new build, which of course I know that Derry has had some fantastic new build and at a scale that hasn't been seen elsewhere, that is really important in addressing housing need. But the other critical one, if you look down at the very bottom, okay, of that table, in 2019, we allocated 6,400 properties a year. I'm going to say we, that's the housing executive and housing associations. This year, last year that we're reporting on, we only had 5,300 allocations. So that's 1,000 allocations less. And the main reason for that is, number one, obviously you've got your new build programme, and that's dependent on available budget from Stormont. But equally as important is the turnover in housing executive and housing association properties. And what we are seeing is a significant downturn in that churn, as we call it. People get a housing executive or a housing association house and they hold on to it for grim death, as you can imagine, because they're good, strong, secure tenancies. They're at an affordable level and people tend to stay put. So the main reason that we get now for termination of tenancies is the death of a tenant. We also have seen a significant rise and increase in the numbers of succession requests. So that is people whose household member has died, the tenant has died, and a succession case is being asked for another member of the family within that household. So over that intervening period, we've had a drop in over 1,000 new available housing, social housing tenancies, okay? You've got this steady homelessness presenting, you've got that lowering and reduction in the numbers of available housing. And you've got this waiting list that those people are just taking longer and longer. So people are sitting in temporary accommodation for much, much longer, and they're not moving out, therefore not freeing up spaces for us to be able to allocate to new presenters that are coming in as well. Okay, so just a wee bit of context there. Next slide looks at Derry and Strabane District Council to give you an idea of scale. Placements in temporary accommodation, the bottom line there that you'll see between 2019 and 2023-24 has gone up by 50%. So the demand for temporary accommodation in Derry and Strabane has increased by 50% over those 4-year period. Okay, and that's people requiring temporary accommodation. I'll go to the next slide. So when we talk about temporary accommodation, so it's not bail hostels, but what is it? What is the accommodation that we put people into while they await their permanent rehousing options? And what are the numbers? Okay, so you see the numbers of presenters that are coming in. Last year, we put 11,368 households in temporary accommodation. Okay, so that's 11,300 were placed in temporary accommodation, of which in Derry and Strabane it was 1,593. So about 10% of all placements into temporary accommodation happened within this council area. And I have to reiterate that the largest demand remains within Belfast. And that's where we would have our largest demand for temporary accommodation, our largest numbers of temporary accommodation. Okay. So just giving you some scale, I hope you find this useful. And then the temporary accommodation demand is, so we've talked about those 11,000 placements. So what type of accommodation do we put them in? And there you see along the bottom the type of accommodation that we use for temporary accommodation. You'll see that nearly 3,000, by far the largest accommodation that we use is what we call single lets, and that's houses or flats. Houses or flats that are own front door. So that is basically a private rented accommodation temporary placement we use. That is by far the largest out of those 6,000 cases that I was saying to you. About 5,000, Brian? Am I doing 5 or 6? 5, there you are. I've just added an extra 1,000 on. Sincere apologies. Could we want? It was yesterday, tomorrow. So 5,000 temporary accommodation places, 3,000 of them in single lets. Okay. The next largest placement is within voluntary sector hostels. I don't need to remind you of the amazing work that's done in voluntary sector hostels in the city. And Derry has a larger proportion of hostel placements than any other part in proportion. So you'll know First Housing, the Damien House, the House in the Wells, Foyle Valley House, New Mission, Foyle's Women's Aid. You know those types of hostels, and that is where there is staff on site, and that wraparound support is given to people who need that extra support through a hostel type placement. So single lets, you can imagine everyone who is homeless, not everyone is complex needs, not everyone has dependency issues. There are people who just need a home, who've lost their private rented accommodation, and it's a family of 4 and they need a house. That's why single lets are the dominant house type that we use for temporary accommodation. Closely followed by voluntary sector hostels, and then following that we have housing executive hostels. So you know we own housing executive hostels, and we do a thing called dispersed lets, and that's where Eddie is using some of his voids to use for temporary accommodation to try and alleviate the pressures on that temporary accommodation. So you'll see there as you go down the sort of numbers, the type of units that we use. We have crash facilities, that's in Belfast, and we have hotels and bed and breakfasts. That has grown significantly over the past couple of years. And we're sitting at around 460, 480 placements across the whole of the north in hotels and bed and breakfasts. And in Derry, that is the disproportionate number. We're sitting with around 200 at any given time in Derry. So that is a higher percentage of hotels and bed and breakfasts that are being used for temporary accommodation in this council area. And the reason for that is because of the inability to be able to get single lets, because of the massive housing pressures in the city. And that, of course, is the wonderful, joyous expansion of the university, the demand for temporary rented accommodation in the city, and that is putting significant pressure on the housing as a whole. So it is, and because we've that statutory duty, somebody phones Brian at 6 o'clock tonight and needs somewhere, we have to find them somewhere. If we don't have hostels, if we don't have single lets, the only opportunity that we have, because we have to fulfil our statutory duty, is to put them into what we call hotel and bed and breakfasts. And we are very happy to share with you the details on that. So the next slide was just to set the scene. 72% of all temporary accommodation in Derry City Council area is own front door houses or flats. So that's single let. So in Derry, it's 72%, vast majority is that own front door. Voluntary sector hostels, 289, as I said, are in, I was explaining the on-site support that is given to residents within those accommodations and the type and the location of some of those. Housing executive hostels, 73 between ourselves and housing associations. And this is the really important one for me. And I'm so happy to be in a position to be able to give you some good news on this one. The other hostel provision that we know is clearly needed in Derry is what we called Derry Dime. Sandra knows only too well the Derry Dime moniker. And that is where for the past 2 years, Eddie has already done the business case, set out all the need for what we're calling dispersed, intensively managed emergency accommodation. And that is for very complex cases, people with addiction problems, mental health problems, who need temporary accommodation, but they need that support wrapped around them. And we only have one service in all of Northern Ireland, and that is in Belfast. And we have just concluded an exercise to secure a specialist service in Derry, and we are hoping that within literally days or a week or so at the most, we will be able to make that announcement about the securing of that new service. So that is much needed for very vulnerable people in Derry. Single lets, as I said to you, 404 are in our single lets across Derry, and the non-standard hotels, which is only used in the absence of the above options and only for as short a duration as possible. Just to be clear, Eddie's team have to phone every morning. Anyone who's sitting in a hotel, bed and breakfast placement, his team have to phone every morning and see can they get those people moved on to more suitable. That's the frequency. That is about trying to move people on. You'll 14% of people in non-standard accommodation are families, 7% are couples, and 79% are singles that are in that. I'm only speaking about the non-standard, the hotels and bed and breakfast. Of those placements, 90% of people placed in bed and breakfasts and hotels in Derry are from Derry. And 93 of them, 93%, if we look at 93%, are from the wider North region. Largely that's the Causeway area, sort of North Antrim upward. So the vast majority of non-standard placements in Derry are to people from the immediate area, okay? Because I know there was some concerns that people seem to feel that there were people from outside the city were being placed here. And just to be clear, there are people from the city who, because of their complex needs, have had to be placed outside Derry. So that traffic goes both ways. But it's 93% of people in that accommodation are from Derry or the immediate north area, the Causeway area. Just to reinforce, we don't use the term bail hostels. That's because we don't run bail hostels. And as Liz has so eloquently showed you, the approved premises, we've heard all about the brilliant work that's being done there. And that's funded by Supporting People, which is a fund that is about support across a variety of vulnerable groups, elderly, young people, people coming out of prison. So I'm going to just conclude and run through the next slide. Papani, which is public protection arrangements. Liz has already gone into that. That is about how the state is protecting the public from people who have public protection arrangements against them. And I've just outlined there what the housing executive's role is in that. We chair the subgroup for accommodation, and we have 2 specified specialist members of staff who are the conduit that works with Liz and her team about the move on accommodation. And that's where the checks are done with PSNI, Probation Board, and you'll see the risk management of that is carried out for sexual and violent offenders. And our housing advisors at that local level work through those structures with those public protection arrangements in cases where public protection is relevant. Moving on from temporary accommodation, obviously, not just for this cohort, but for all cohorts, is the housing supply issue, which we've already done to death. With that particular cohort, the community resistance and people's reluctance to have people with records that are through the public protection arrangements moving within their community, and of course a reluctance to move on from people who are afraid of moving on elsewhere. The next slide, I'll not go into it all in depth, but I think it's important to point out we're talking about public protection arrangements, people coming out of prison, but equally as important is the work that is done to support victims of domestic violence in particular. And I've just outlined a little bit there what we do under what we call the MARAC processes. And that is where the housing executive helps support the victims of violent crime and domestic abuse. We, of our homeless applicants, we've around 1,000 households every year who present to us with for those reasons. And of course, we have the 83,000 housing executive houses that I'm a landlord manager for, and protecting those tenants as well. That is in 2 ways. One is to find them a place of safety through the homelessness service that we've already explained. And the other one is to protect them within the home. And that is through what we call the sanctuary scheme. And that's additional protective measures that we provide to properties to allow victims to remain in their home with safety and security. An important element is recognising the domestic abuse and the increasing numbers of victims of domestic abuse coming to us through the homelessness route. And we have introduced a domestic abuse action plan just at the end of last year. And we're working with the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls team, and our homeless services will be wrapped around those specific victims. So I just want to conclude. There is a program called Complex Lives. Okay, this is a program that is run by Belfast City Council. So it is a council-led program. The Housing Executive and a number of other agencies are significant funders of that program. And we would very much ask Derry Council to consider the potential for Complex Lives to be introduced into the city. The reason for that is that it is about dealing with particularly rough sleepers, but vulnerable people who are subject to street activity or behaviours that is creating antisocial behaviour within your city. That is as a result of the complex nature of the individuals, the addiction issues, the mental health issues, and it's about bringing the support to the individual in that whole systems way. So Belfast City Council bring all the agencies together to try and bring their services to that individual to try and wrap around that support. So it's a housing first approach. It's about getting accommodation for the person and then wrapping all that support around it. I cannot recommend it enough. It has been piloted in Belfast. We are a significant funder of that, and I know that Derry Council had been asking about this service and what its potential might be for it to be considered for Derry. So that's a sort of almost ask or a proposal that I would put forward to the council. And I will now
Shush. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that presentation. Councillor Logue.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you very much, Jennifer, for that presentation. Indeed, some of the statistics there are going to be very, very useful for all of us. And I just want to thank Brian and Eddie too for their attendance. Hopefully they'll be able to, they'll answer the questions, yeah. No, but just I suppose, obviously, all councillors here, and I would go as far as to say everybody in this room understand the challenges that the housing executive have at the moment. We all work on it day and daily, and I would have to say that 80% of a councillor's work is taken up with homelessness issues and trying to get people in a proper accommodation. And I suppose too that, you know, we talk about the availability and all of that, and we who worked in the area, the recent area plan, were successful in getting a higher number of what the projected need was into that plan. So we actually got the department to agree to our number, because we certainly recognise that there's evidential need within this council district. But of course, we need to keep building and we need to keep providing those homes. Also, I would have to say the cohort of applicants are changing. I mean, I'm old enough to know that we stayed in the family home until you get married or moved away and get work. Now people want to go out, love their own lives, have their own, and rightly so. So they're not staying in family homes anymore until their big day or whatever. They're wanting their own place. And so that has to be taken into consideration as well when we look at the need for single lets, etc. And there is a high number of single let applicants within our council district too as well. I want to welcome I will welcome but the pre-notification of the Dine project. I know this council area has been working very, very hard, and councillors, not name them, but they know who they are, have been working with the housing executive in order to bring this much needed project to this council district. And, you know, it's going to be very, very welcomed. We certainly need it. The evidence is there. And also there is a project already out there, and we see that it works and it is a perfect model. So hopefully, you know, that project can, the announcement's going to be made, which is great, but that it can be put into action very, very soon too as well. I want to acknowledge our own homeless team here in the city, because they do work, and across the council district, but the main homeless team who work here, who work tirelessly, was under very challenging circumstances too as well. You know, they are, you know, they must be traumatized themselves too, I'm sure, when they get presenters and who are very vulnerable, went through traumatic issues to themselves, and they've nowhere to lay their heads at night. But I have to say, as well as the homeless team working in the housing executive, we also have an excellent support team from the community and voluntary sector who help make these people's lives better. And I just want to thank everybody too for that as well. I just want to, I think it's good that the strategy, the strategy that the housing supply, I think, strategy that was mentioned there, were people trying to keep people in homes, is also good. But there is one other wee thing that's close to me, and I already know what I'm going to say. And I think, Brian, I might have mentioned it to you too as well in a Zoom meeting. We have a lot of people who are deemed homeless, and they're homeless because of their circumstance. But that does not mean they don't have a roof over their head at this certain time. It just means that the home that they're living in presently is not suitable for their needs. We have many people, maybe in 3 or 4 bedroom houses, who are not able to go up the stairs anymore, who, for whatever reason, the house is too big, etc., etc. And then we have younger families looking for bigger homes. There's a whole, you know what I'm talking about yourself, people's issues. But I would love to see a dedicated piece of work done in Derry, like a pilot, where I know the housing, the patch managers and the housing officers try to manage housing solutions where they see them. But it does take an awful lot of work. And I would like to see the housing executive put in place a dedicated team to carry out a scheme in this council area where we can look in depth at everybody's application and see if the homelessness numbers can be helped in that way. I think, you know, I'm doing all these jigs in my head at night, thinking, oh God, if they would move there and they would move there, wouldn't it be great? And people might want to go or whatever, but I think we at least have to try. And so I do think that would go a long way in putting a dent in the homelessness numbers in this council district as a pilot, and then maybe it could be rolled out elsewhere too as well. But it's going to take resource, and that's where I would be asking for a dedicated team. But look, thank you very much for the presentation. It's great that we have been given all these slides, and all those statistics are very much welcomed. And I also wanted, nearly forgot there, but I just have it on my notes here too as well. That scheme regarding complex lives certainly would be very, very welcomed in this council district. So if it takes whatever to bring that forward, or maybe we can ask officers to bring a paper to bring that forward to members to see how we can have that model here too within our city. So yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Logue. Do you want to respond to that? And then I'll bring Councillor.
Very happy to. I love your. Like Cilla Black, I'd love to do the data matching, okay, you know, the dating, you know, so one of our big issues is under occupancy within our homes. And you know, that obviously is supported through the bedroom tax, as it's called, where the additional funding is given in to make up for the difference in the benefits for under occupancy in terms of bedroom size. So I love. There is no doubt the housing executive has a lot of family accommodation. When we were building, you know, it was houses that we were building. The need for accommodation now, 50% of our waiting list is single people. And it's not just those leaving home at an earlier stage, but it's also, unfortunately, relationships breaking down and one household becoming 2 households. And therefore, the complexity of often a single person can need access, room and availability to access children and you know, continue that strong relationship and that. So the whole thing for us is the house swap side of things. So the direct exchanges is a route that actually, through the fundamental review of allocations, there's a massive promotion is underway to do a Cilla Black and to match those people, but trying to promote that, to let people know, those that are under occupying, that are looking for somewhere smaller, that they can meet each other and that they can actually do that swap. Because I'm with you, there's a lot of under occupancy. However, there is also intergenerational houses and homes that housing executive tenants, you know, when it was the mother's house and that's where they all come on a Sunday to be together and often don't think the house is too big, even though it's maybe only an older person living in a 4-bed house on their own. So actually we've done a lot of latent demand testing and went out and spoke to individuals about, and with the financial inducement, would you consider moving to smaller properties? And we were very disappointed in the level of uptake on those that were willing to move. So somewhere in between that, I think we'll find the perfect match.
Yeah, Mayor, if you'll allow me, please. I certainly am not advocating that people are approached who live in a family home all their life. What I'm looking for is for people who are already on the list. I'm not advocating that people should be approached, do you want to move out of your home or anyway. It's for people who are already on the list. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lowe. Councillor Farrell.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks for everyone who's come today. I just want to touch briefly on Jennifer's remarks. So first of all, on behalf of the SLP, we'd like to welcome the potential progress with DIME. I know Eddie's been working for a number of years on that, and if there's good news in the next couple of days, it'll be down to Eddie's diligence. In terms of the Complex Lives programme that's active in Belfast, we think that sounds like a good idea. And I'd like to make a formal proposal that a paper is presented to the relevant committee so members can give that due consideration. If it can help the homeless situation across this city, that's something that we should definitely explore. And Jennifer, Eddie is in here twice a year at least, speaking about homeless figures, speaking about the need for investment in housing right across the city and district. He's a regular attender, is a credit to the organisation, is so approachable, but that does not detract from the fact that we have a housing crisis in this city. There's over 6,300 people on the waiting list at the minute. The new waiting list comes out in 2 weeks. I would expect that to increase. It's increased, you know, for years, every quarter. The housing executive themselves have done data analysis about the housing need across the city and district, and the housing executive is saying we need to build 800 houses per year for the next 5 years to address that demand. And there isn't money in the budget for 800 houses in this city and district. There's enough for 1,400 houses per year at the minute across the entire north. So I don't see how we're getting 800 houses per year because other council areas do exist. When we look at the funding issue, we look at the issue with Northern Ireland Water, where houses that have been funded, that have planning approval, can't be built because there's no investment in the wastewater infrastructure. It's a mess at the minute. People are being let down. Thousands of people across the city and district are being let down on a daily basis because they cannot get access to housing. And that's where temporary or emergency accommodation comes in. And I know through the homeless legislation that the housing executive has a duty to offer accommodation to people who present and meet the requirements. But we're here specifically on the back of a motion from Councillor Raymond Barr, and it was about a really unfortunate incident in Ballymagorry where a young man lost his life. And the perpetrator or proposed alleged perpetrator was staying at a bail hostel in Ballymagorry, and I know that term isn't used in the north or by the housing executive, but in terms of if somebody applies for temporary or emergency accommodation, is that a question that is asked to them? Are they asked, are there bail conditions, or do you have bail conditions? Or, so for example, would you have any idea how many people are currently housed in emergency or temporary accommodation across this city and district that are on bail? They mightn't be in a bail hostel, but they have bail conditions. So would you have any idea of that? Because it would be useful to know, but thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Farrell. Do you want to respond to that?
Brian, I might bring you, the answer is no, we don't, just to be about, we do not know the numbers that have bail conditions. What we do though, do is we're part of a process in terms of the high risk cases where as part of the housing requirement, we are a key statutory agency within that. So I'll explain that to you. And Brian, maybe just to, in terms of what the work that we do from with prisoners who are about to be released through housing rights and the work we support there.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. So Liz talked about the positive relations between ourselves and probation, and I think that extends across the kind of criminal justice space. I spent yesterday up at Stormont in the morning and in the afternoon with both Housing Rights and the Department of Justice. We currently have a pilot project where we have our housing advisors based in the prisons to look at some of that information that supports, for all the reasons that Liz said earlier about the successful reintegration of former prisoners into the community. So it is a conversation. We do ask for quite a lot of information to support the right move, to get the right support, to connect with the right agencies, to support someone's reintegration into local community. Sometimes people will tell us information that will help us, or sometimes it won't. A lot of the providers we work with will have some of that information, and we live in a society where people Google stuff, so we don't always know that, but we do have a process, a protocol in place with the 3 prisons, and we're developing those local relationships with the local prisons as well, because they do different things, McGilligan, Hyde Bank and Maghaberry. So we currently have a prisoner protocol with Housing Rights and the Prison Service. We have housing advisors based in the prison at the moment, testing it out earlier so that we can work with people before they leave to try and get the right information to make the right placement, so that's more successful integration into the community, and that we try to make the right placement in terms of temporary accommodation into the community that we're returning to, and work with our partners in the voluntary community sector around the wraparound support, or with our colleagues in probation around other aspects of what they need to do. So there are areas that we would like to do better on, and the prison protocol is another piece of work I think would be really helpful for us to kind of explain. In the complex lives process that we have in Belfast, the interesting thing about that is we have what we call a multidisciplinary team process, where we have the voluntary sector in the room, along with our advisors, our patch managers, probation or prison service reps, and working that. So that is a conduit for better sharing of information that allows some of those issues to be managed better. We acknowledge the reality of that situation, Staban, and so there's always ways that we want to do to improve the information flow or the assessment of need in that space. So that's what we're trying to do. So those pieces of work I think are very helpful, and Jennifer's already mentioned the complex lives process. And again, we currently are in Hyde Bank from the young people leaving that for that process as well. We're seeing that move on. And when we get that right from people coming out of juvenile justice or Hyde Bank, again, we're able to create a better outcome for the young person in that process. So work on ongoing that might be useful to kind of bring back to ready to update you on if that's helpful.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, Councillor Raymond Barr on 9.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you to Jennifer for the presentation, and also to Brian and Eddie for attending here today. As Patricia said earlier, councillors aren't in any doubt as to the pressures that the housing executive are under. But when it comes to approved accommodation, given that, as Councillor Farrell alluded to, the incident in Ballymagorry, a lot of questions are being asked in the district around this issue. But a couple of questions. Just I want to start with the first question that I asked of the probation board there. The claim that 41% of the entire budget allocated to temporary accommodation has been spent in our council area. Can anybody comment on the accuracy of that claim? Another question. According to the presentation, and I've no reason to doubt it, but the housing executive do due diligence when making decisions to place someone in a particular environment. And I know it's an uncomfortable conversation, but I'm going to go back to the Ballymagorry incident again, and the premises that were being used, the Clock Tower, the Coach Inn. When you have a number of people housed in one building, as was the case in Clock Tower, and bearing in mind these people could be charged with violent crime, drug abuse, substance or drug abuse, sex offending. Is there any monitoring or control practices in place, or are they free to come and go as they please, as the people on these premises were? You know, at the end of the day, if there had been some stringent preventative precautions in place, that young lad that died in Ballinbulgara could possibly still be alive today. And it begs the question, have residents living in close proximity to approved accommodation not got a right to know the nature of offences those housed there are charged with? Thank you.
Councillor Barr. Jennifer?
Thank you so much. 40% of the budget question, Councillor Barr, is it is not 40% of the budget, but what it is in that cohort, if you remember, it's single lets that we said is the largest proportion, 3,000 of the 5,000, not 6, as I previously said. Temporary accommodation places are in single lets. The 40% would be with reference purely to the cohort of bed and breakfast and hotels. So of the total number of bed and breakfast and hotels that the Housing Executive currently uses, around half of it, 40%, is within the Derry City area, council area, and therefore that element of the budget would be 41% of the cost of the non-standard bed and breakfast hotels. However, if you remember, that's only 460 out of the 5,000 temporary accommodation places that we provide. So the vast majority of the temporary accommodation spend would not be in Derry, but it is a very large proportion of that particular cohort. Okay. Monitoring processes, Brian, I'm looking to yourself in terms of the people who are placed in non-standard accommodation. We talked about the public protection arrangements for the high-risk placements, and obviously we work through a process in terms of making placements in that particular category. If someone has offences and are not being released from prison and it was some years away and previous, then that information would not be part of the placement information. But maybe just reiterate about the monitoring processes and the fact that within that non-standard, remember I said Eddie's team every morning has to try and get people moved out of the bed and breakfast accommodation, because that is not where we want people to be. We want them to be in those incredibly wonderful managed services that the voluntary and community sector are providing for us in such numbers in Derry, and the Derry Dime will hopefully expand that process. So it is only in a shorted, rare, brief and non-recurrent is the term we like to use. So that is, it is emergency placements that we try to move on as quickly as possible. But monitoring and placing.
So the kind of monitoring and placement starts from the point of presentation. So we work on a homeless assessment process that Jennifer set out there to determine whether someone's eligible for homeless assistance. But when we get to make an individual placement, all of the local teams, Eddie's team included, work on a process around a common assessment form, which goes into so much more detail around if there's a drug and alcohol issues, if there's family breakdown issues, if there's issues around custody, if there's issues around release from prison, if there's any offending issues in that space. That's part of an ongoing interview process that the housing advisor has with the individual who's presented as homeless. We use that information to try to match individuals to the right type of accommodation. That's a challenge when pressures in the system. But in Derry, there's, as Jennifer says, we have a range of excellent voluntary community sector services, specialised in certain areas. So clearly we've got an individual woman presenting with a history of domestic abuse, and we have around 1,000 plus individuals present that. We'd be looking to work with the women's aid sector. We have a process in place to do that. So the starting point is to come a process, but we collect that right information in the conversation with the individual that helps us make the right placement. For those in single lets, we try to provide a wraparound service as well. There are floating support and other services. So while we focus on the hostels, it's also really important to reflect the really good work of the floating support services and many of the services in the city provide across all the client groups. So again, if it's in a single let, we'll look to wrap around the floating support service or in our colleagues. For the high-risk offenders, as Liz said earlier, they tend to come through the PANI process. So not everyone who's been released from prison will be presenting with risk factors. So that's an important factor. I think a number of people have recognised around that kind of integration point that there may be other factors, and once they're in release position, the work that's gone on within the prison service around rehabilitation works, and they want to resume their life. And we're seeing that through the complex life process. So we have this common assessment process that we work with, and sometimes it's a bane of our frontline office because it's the right information to go to the provider to get the right placement. There are challenges, as Liz says, sometimes around getting the right placement at the right time. Again, the local teams, including Eddie's team, are trying to find the right placement. So if we do make a placement in today into a non-standard, and we think another place is more appropriate, we will do that. The other thing to say is that it's not a single point in time assessment. We have an ongoing relationship, like our patch managers, with the client, with the customer, with the person who's presented. So if other information comes to light, or they disclose something to us, or feel more comfortable telling us stuff, we will use that to inform what we do next in terms of either trying to find alternative time accommodation or making referrals to other services in terms of their support needs. So I suppose it's really important that in many cases we build up a trusted relationship with the individual customer to do that process. We do put additional checks in. We've just had a pose of our teams going around to get some assurance. If we have any concerns about placements, then we will make alternative placements, and we'll link in with our colleagues within probation or others around if there are risk factors that we're picking out on to do that, to not make a placement. And the challenge for us, though, is, as Emma says, our obligations are onerous and quite easily maintained, so we have to find alternative accommodation, and hence why that sometimes people are placed outside of a city or somewhere else. Sometimes they're out of a place because of the threat to them. Sometimes our individuals, I remember going to a service about 2 years ago in Belfast, not in Derry, wouldn't happen in Derry, and there was some concern from the local community about the level of police contact with the premises. And the reality for us is that the police were very clear to say often our customers are the victim as well of a crime as much as the perpetrator, so it's that balance. So we do go out, and we've just got a team who've gone around all our non-standard facilities at the moment to do a reassurance check, and we link in with them around that. If we have any concerns about the need of a client, we will do to move them into the right accommodation at the first point, but there is that challenge in that process. So we currently have a clear protocol in place with the prison service around the release of prisoners that tries to get involved to get the right information to support the frontline teams before that. And we have those 2 specialist officers that we said, in our presentation, that link in with Annie. But if there's any concerns from the local teams can contact them around the needs of the individuals and to say, and then we can go back to our colleagues in police or probation to look at the needs of the individual if we have got any concerns that we're not getting the full picture.
Thank you, Brian.
If I could just come in.
Yeah.
Just one thing for clarity around some of the issues around non-standard accommodation. And I think there's a misunderstanding publicly around this. In fact, that we would place people in non-standard accommodation, and that's it. Jennifer has already alluded to the vast majority, 72% of our population of homeless that are in temporary accommodation are in appropriate temporary accommodation with their own front door key. The people that are non-standard, there is a support project in place in here in the city, and it has started with myself and the housing executive in partnership with First Housing, and it's an intense support project, and the vast majority, if not all of the clients, has gone through that support project is in non-standard accommodation. So it's not to say that we're putting people into non-standard accommodation and they don't receive anything. They don't receive anything because we recognise. And I've been in many a task force that was set up here by Derry City and Strabane District Council in relation to the impact of non-standard accommodation. So we recognise that the impact that has had, but we are providing an awful lot of support to a lot of individuals in non-standard accommodation, and we are in regular contact and support needs and also occupancy. So it's not to say that people are being put on the non-standard accommodation and that's the end of their journey. That's not the end of their journey. There's a comprehensive piece of work that takes place in terms of supporting those individuals, finding the wraparound services and finding a more appropriate accommodation when we get those needs identified. And it's just to make sure that everybody clearly understands that.
Thank you, Eddie. I have Councillor Harkin.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to Jennifer, Brian and Eddie for coming in today. And look, Jennifer, your presentation went beyond, in some ways, the scope of the meeting today, and I appreciate that. And we do, as a council, appreciate the work that the housing executive does day to day, trying to ensure that people have homes to live in, trying to help people who are homeless, and doing much, much else. And we also appreciate the scale of pressure that that you're under, because we have a massive housing crisis, and it is not a housing crisis that is becoming more manageable. In many ways, it's actually getting worse. And this is a housing crisis that we have across this island. We have almost 300,000 people on housing waiting lists, north and south. We have 200,000 empty properties, north and south. And for me, the reason why we have this crisis is because there's been far too much privatisation, far too much dominance of the economy, north and south, by landlords, far too much dominance of the economy, north and south, by vulture funds that don't prioritise putting people into homes, but are prioritising profiteering from housing. And what we've actually caused is a lot of housing misery. And the housing executive are caught in the crossfire of that. And that's why for housing executive workers on a day-to-day basis, they're not paid enough. How could you be, given the kind of pressures that you're under? And the housing executive isn't funded well enough as well to meet the scale of the crisis. So we've been presented with a housing supply strategy to build 100,000 houses with no money attached to it, and no urgency. And I think that the pressure is only going to grow on the housing executive. So that's very clear. So I think we need a completely different model to deal with the housing crisis, to move us forward. But on this, look, I really, in terms of the scope of the meeting, like, I appreciate what the clarifications that have been given, because look, I'm well aware of the kind of work that the housing executive does, the work that frontline homelessness services do, and there is a perception that we have a large number of non-standard accommodation where people possibly on bail are in without any wraparound services. And that's been the issue. So basically, people who need a lot of help are being put into non-standard accommodation, and it's not actually helping them, and then it's leading to antisocial behaviour. That I think is the perception out there. Sometimes maybe exploited cynically by people, even if they know better. But the clarifications that I think we're getting today are very, very helpful, and I think it's a very positive thing if we are going to have a much more systematic approach to wraparound services for many of the people who will benefit from it. That is only going to be a good thing. It's frustrating that it's only going to be launched, but it is good that we're moving forward with that. Look, and we also are far too reliant on non-standard accommodation. I mean, that is not something I think that the housing executive celebrates, and that means that we simply have to build more appropriate accommodation for the people who are on the waiting list, and for people who will benefit from having the solidity of an actual home and a house and a front door key, whether that is a 3-bedroom house, a 1-bedroom flat, or a 2-bedroom accommodation. So I think that this has been helpful today, in terms of the description of the work that the housing executive is actually undertaking with people who you would consider would need more help, and that will only be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harkin. I will bring in Councillor Jason Barr online.
Thank you very much, Mayor, for allowing me in, and thanks to everybody for coming along today for this very important meeting. And I know I will relay back to what Councillor Barr said, that this meeting was set up in regards to the unfortunate tragedy that took place in Balmagorry in October. Unfortunately, the victim in this was a very close relative of mine, a first cousin, so I know firsthand the devastation this has caused to our family. But just a few questions that I've got just regarding around unapproved accommodation within certain areas. So do you know, like the Probation Board of the Housing Executive, know who you're placing in an unapproved or approved accommodation, and are you aware of their criminal records before they're placed in to unapproved accommodation? For example, the coach in, like, was it the housing executive's decision that this would be a great location for this type of accommodation to be used, so close to a primary school and so close to a very quiet village, a lot of rural dwellers? Going back to a point that was made also about vital homeless place has been taken up by those from other areas. Now, I do understand, yes, the point was made that circumstances for their own safety, they have to be moved out of their own areas. But surely not 100% of these beds are taken up for people that have to leave for their own safety. For example, a few weeks ago, I made a phone call for a lady and her children who were in dire need of homeless accommodation, and they were told that the only place available to them then and there was Belfast. And obviously we're aware that people from Belfast are living in our area, so surely, you know, there has to be some sort of thing in place where some beds are kept available locally for those that need it locally. It's not always accommodating for people to travel so far away, especially for support networks and stuff. Also, does the Probation Board of the Housing Executive keep in contact with police or the owners of these unapproved premises to make sure anyone availing of these premises aren't posing a risk to the community they are placed in before being granted a place in any of these areas? And in these areas, are these areas assessed, as it probably goes back to a previous question, like why was Balmagorry deemed as a suitable location close to primary schools? Who makes those decisions? Do you believe as organisations that neighbours, especially those like was the school consulted, was the neighbours around Balmagorry consulted of who may be living among them? This also goes for towns and cities. Is that done? And do you believe it should be done? As I know a lot of people were very angry after the incident in October. They weren't aware who's living among them, which does pose a lot of fear, especially in the elderly community and young families living in these areas. And finally, Mayor, thank you very much for the due diligence. And again, thank you to yourselves. The final question I would have is, what lessons has been learned since October? And what do you believe should be the solution to these ongoing worrying situations and issues that locals have of who may be living among them? Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to respond?
I'll maybe do a general, and then we'll go into the specifics. Thank you, Councillor Barr. There is no doubt that it was a dreadful tragedy, and the housing executive, you know, extends its full sympathy to family, friends, and loved ones of the young chap in Ballymagordy. So I think that in terms of, I go straight to the lessons learned piece, we stopped using the premises immediately, obviously, and it had only been in the specific premises had only been non-standard bed and breakfast, had only been in use for a few months, Brian, from memory, and without any complaints having been received from the housing to the housing executive prior to that. So obviously I'll not get into any of the details on the individual case. It really is not appropriate. But with regard to lessons learned, the securing of crises bed and breakfast accommodation for any of our cohorts of homeless applicants is looked at very thoroughly, and Brian will give you the process that we use for that non-standard. But I was very struck by councillors in this chamber today at how, even with that very challenging behaviour of residents within hostels, that in fact they have integrated very well in the community in the vast majority of cases. And we heard about the approved premises and how that is not causing an issue within the community within which it's cited. So I do think we need to put it into context in terms of the vast majority of accommodation that is provided does not see significant levels of antisocial behaviour associated with it. And when it does, it is entirely appropriate that the housing executive responds to that and puts checks and balances in place prior to bringing that accommodation on. Our new service that we hope will be getting up and running in the coming weeks will in fact hopefully allow us to move out of the use of non-standard accommodation in a number of cases, and we do have an ambition to grow that service to be able to deal with those most vulnerable in our society. And they are people from our society who are in temporary accommodation, and to ensure that they're given accommodation that is suitable for them. So our ambition as an organisation and our lessons learned of all use of bed and breakfast is that we want to drive that down as best we can, simply because own front door is exactly what a human right should be. It is not in a room in a shared premises with no cooking facilities or washing facilities. So you can imagine that that is our ambition, and that is where we're aiming to land. Brian, maybe just on the process of how we secure non-standard and just divest of non-standard.
So, you know, I've worked in the homelessness sector and SP sector for a long time. So the fact that we sit with such high use of non-standard does not sit easy with us. We balance that about the need to find people in acute crisis accommodation, so they're not on the street. However, we recognise the responsibility we have in that. So we have a regional group that meets regularly with all the local managers, including across Northern Ireland, before we bring on any non-standard for use. We do some checks at that. We engage with the owners and the providers so that they understand what we are doing and why we're doing what we're doing. And also understand the nature of that people are coming in crisis. The experience of homelessness in itself is a difficult thing to go through, let alone any other kind of personal issues that you may have that may lead to the homelessness situation. So we have a regular meeting with our colleagues across each of the local offices before we consider. So we try to look at the balance between access to services on bus routes, the kind of things we need to. If we've got not an oversupply, we're already using facilities in the same area to try and get a balance. We are also trying to get that balance between where services are and where people need to be. There are reasons why some people might need to be away from the place, but equally, you know, our processes and our focus is on trying to get the right balance of accommodation options in each area. We do try to look at the point I think you raised around, can you hold the bed spaces available? That's really challenging when there's such pressure on the system and then basically you're paying for places not being in use, but we do look at every opportunity in that. So we have a team that links in with local officers like Eddie to check in before we use anything, or if we need to exit, we work with the owners or the providers of the services so they ensure they know what we are about and what we're doing. We have regular contact with them. We link in, make sure they're linked in with the point Eddie made earlier, that there are a range of local services and arrangements in place in each locality to try and provide any support place. And if there are any issues, we will follow up on that. So we have a good communication with them around if there are issues emerging to do that. So those are the pressures. Locally, I think Eddie might want to talk a wee bit more about what his arrangements are, but that's generally what we do locally, centrally.
Certainly, as Jennifer has said earlier, there's been a huge rise in non-standard accommodation in the city, and nobody wants that or dislikes that more than myself as the local manager. And that has resulted in impacts in the city. And as a result, the council here had set up a task force specifically to deal with the issues of non-standard temporary accommodation. And there was a level of issues, and the last speaker touched on that. One was the saturation and the negative impact that was having in terms of some areas of the city. The levels of antisocial behaviour that has been, as a result of that. And Jennifer touched on this before, external placements, and those were the broad issues that was brought to the task force and certainly brought to myself in terms of the impact it would have. And I was happy to report the last task force that we've stopped using at least 4 or 5 of those accommodation units that was brought to us in relation to all of those issues. And Jennifer has more or less drawn the line under the increase of non-standard accommodation in the city. So we have broadly addressed a lot of the issues that has came before us, that has been brought to elected members in relation to location, antisocial behaviour, and all the negative impact that it's having in the city. And we are moving away from that. We are desperate to move away from that non-standard model into a model that provides support. And I'm very happy that we will get the announcement hopefully very soon, and we can start to build on the successes that we have already had. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Members, I do not see anybody else indicating to speak, so it is just left for me to say on behalf of our chamber here and all the members, thank you so much for taking your time to come and speak to us and to give us really informative messages today. I think we have some really good news to celebrate, and I look forward to a paper being brought here to start the new Complex Lives project here in Derry. I think it will be very exciting, and thank you for responding to all the questions in an honest manner, and it is just left of me to say this meeting is adjourned.